Hello, and thank you for joining me in this workshop, working with youth experiencing chronic trauma within a child protection setting. My name is Peter Smyth. I'm a social worker and have been working in child protection for over 3 decades. A majority of that time working with youth specifically, and a subset of youth even further, those that we label high-risk youth, as you can see with the labels on the picture on this first slide. This is my area of passion, working to make child protection more relevant to the youth that we're serving and honoring their voices. Over the years, youth have complained about the traditional way of doing child protection, which is typically punitive rather than relationship based. So a lot of focus in my career has been shifting, trying to make that shift to a relationship based practice that is more meaningful and more relevant in the lives of the youth that we're serving. Just a timeline for the High Risk Youth Initiative, and that we started with the first caseload in 1999, and this involved shifting practice quite significantly from what was typically being done at the time. In 2005, the first caseload became a unit of 6 social workers, and I was a supervisor for that unit. In 2006, we started the High Risk Youth Multi-Disciplinary Consultation team, and that was an opportunity for caseworkers working with very challenging, troubled, damaged youth, and we're looking for support and some guidance and out of the box and more flexible, creative ways in working with youth, recognizing that the traditional approach wasn't that effective. In 2012, the High Risk Youth Initiative started, so then it became a program serving the whole of Edmonton area, and indeed now many parts of the province of Alberta as well. Also attached to this initiative are conferences that we've had, 3 to date in 2014, 2016, and 2018. We were going to have one in 2020, but COVID came into the picture and that had to be cancelled. So we're looking at having the next conference in 2021. Initially, it was called the High Risk Youth Conference, but we didn't like that label, so renamed it the Allies for Youth Connections Conference. And in 2017, I had a book published discussing the whole practice framework and again emphasizing the need to shift from a relationship-based practice from a traditionally punitive approach. So we call the youth the disconnected. They're often youth that have no stable, healthy adults in their lives, and being in the system that their relationships with social workers and service providers are often problematic, conflictual. Many of these youth have been labeled manipulative or defiant, also uncooperative, resistant, and then with the power that we have as workers, we can determine whether the youth is even worthy enough to get services based on their attitude that we perceive. But of course, we know much of the comments and the actions of the youth that we're working with is based out of fear and often previous traumatic experiences, having much rejection and abandonment throughout their lives. And so they tend to come by that honestly, and we see that testing behavior. So we can either decide to see it for what it is and work through that with the youth in a relationship building way, or we can label them and call them problematic youth, and they're not ready or they're not worthy of receiving services. So these typically struggle with authority and don't have any people in their lives that they can safely reach out to or trust. And trust tends to be a long way away from many of these youth because of the number of times that the trust has been broken throughout their lives. So they live risk-filled lifestyles characterized by such things as drugs, sexual exploitation, violence, living on the street, and of course family breakdown, which often brings child protection into their lives in the first place. But we also know they have strengths and they have resiliency that we can build on, and they can survive. They're resourceful, and if they're given some guidance and have people that they can reach out to and start to build connections with, it can make a significant impact on their lives. Not just on the youth either, it can also have a big impact on our lives as well, as we typically go into the field to make a difference, have an impact on people, children, youth, and families. And so it's a journeying together through this, through the challenges that the youth are facing, can be certainly areas that the youth and us as workers can benefit from. So who are high-risk youth? They're defined by the level of risk, regardless of their age. So we don't have a particular age, especially on the lower end. We had a 10-year-old on a high-risk youth caseload, which I never thought I would see happen. But her needs were very dramatic and benefited from being placed on a high-risk youth caseload with a worker who was very engaged with this child. Um, so we are seeing more youth. I don't think it's unique to Edmonton's jurisdiction or Alberta's jurisdiction, but others as well, where they're seeing children as young as 10, 11, 12 on the streets, having experienced a lot of very challenging, traumatic experiences in their short lives. Also, the use of drugs and alcohol, which are interfering with day-to-day functioning. So these aren't the youth that are experimenting with drugs. These are youth typically using drugs and alcohol to numb out, escape their pain. As Gabor Mate says, it's not why the addiction, it's why the pain. And youth will often turn to other addictions, and not just alcohol, drugs, but it could be cutting or self-harming. It could be sex, could be gambling, could be um, devices, it could be crime. Lots of different addictions that we see that gives them that rush or hit of dopamine. But often drugs do the same function. Um, but there could be also trying to self-medicate to stop the chaos going on in their heads as well, with their difficulty in self-regulating. The choices that they are making jeopardize their safety, and this could be who they're associating with, where they're living, if they're on the. They cannot identify a healthy adult in their lives outside of the professional community, and sometimes not even a member of the professional community. But as I said, um, that's why we call them the disconnected. They struggle with authority figures, as I had mentioned, have been in and out of placements for a lot of their lives. Not uncommon for some of the youth to have had 30, 40, 50 placements, whether they started with foster care, with family members perhaps, into group homes, into treatment facilities, into hospitals, or whatever the shelters, whatever the case is, but they have had many, many placements and often aren't staying put in any of them unless, of course, they're in a locked facility. Multiple file closures due to lack of follow through by the youth, and it's not uncommon to see youth that have had their file open and closed 10, 12, 15 times, which is challenging because there's often a pattern to the behaviors and a pattern to the family dysfunction, and without the proper help to attend to the challenges that child and the youth and the family are experiencing, we tend to see them repeated. Youth are often at risk for sexual exploitation, mostly girls, but also boys, um, in that they may end up being sexually exploited, possibly for drugs, for a place to stay, for food, for clothes, jewelry, um, whatever the case may be, or they may be pimped out as well uh, for money, and so that becomes an extreme risk. And the younger they are, they're less likely to be able to see the risk signs, and are very easy targets to be sexually exploited. And also, many of our youth have multi-generational involvement in the child protection system. Um, 70% of the youth are Indigenous, and we know from colonialism, the residential school system, and the 60s scoop that there is that multi-generational trauma, and we're dealing with multiple generations of family, which is very sad and still speaks to the systemic racism that we see in our systems. So just some high-risk youth demographics. These are dramatically high numbers for the most part, and disturbing but not shocking, I would say. 94% of our youth struggle with drugs and alcohol addiction. Um, 93%, and these are estimates over time, 93% of our youth struggling or diagnosed with mental health issues. And we know addictions and mental health often go hand in hand. 30 to 40% of our youth struggle with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. So when you combine possibly addictions, mental health, uh, the trauma they've experienced has had an impact on brain development, which we'll be going into shortly. And then on the fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. They're just incredibly complex and challenging youth to work with. 95% of the youth have had involvement with the justice system, and that may be anything from a ticket for not paying to get on public transport, all the way up to murder charges, of which there's very few at that end. And 90% of our youth have dropped out of school. And it's not to suggest that school isn't important to these youth, because it often very much is. Even when we're service planning with them, one of their goals is very, very typically to go back to school, get an education, and some do get there, and some even go on to university. But it remains important to them. But for the chaos going on in their lives, there's a very high dropout rate. And a lot of the youth don't feel they have a sense of belonging in the school, or their behavior isn't conducive to being in a regular school, and they're getting suspended frequently, or they're getting kicked out of the school, and then trying to adapt to perhaps alternative programs, which have been more successful for our youth. So they tend to get delayed in their schooling, as the good news is that a lot of them do go back to school. As I mentioned, 70% of our youth have an Indigenous background. In Alberta, Indigenous people make up about 6 to 7% of the population. So you can see how dramatically overrepresented they are in the child protection system. 85% of our youth are female, and this has been going all the way back to 1999 with the first caseload. This has been a consistent theme. Lots of theories around why that might be the case. Some of what we do feel is some of the youth, female youth, are more open to reaching out or accepting services. Males might perhaps find other resources, places to stay, where females can be more at risk to be sexually exploited. And I think there's attitudes in society as well. that contributes to that number, but it's remained very constant. 20 to 25% of our youth are pregnant or parenting, and there's some dads as well that we're working with. So again, a high number there. But 80% of our youth that we work with are voluntary. The others are wards of the government. Um, so we think that we're having some impact in youth wanting the help and wanting relationships with healthy adults that are open to working in a more flexible and creative way with the youth. And when that connection is made, then the youth don't want to lose that connection. So we do have a high voluntary rate with the youth, which is satisfying. A significant majority of our youth have no healthy or caring adults in their lives, and this is the area where we need to really focus on us being that healthy or caring adult that's open to building a connection with the youth. And of course, the last one, which I mentioned already, is that 100% of our youth have experienced early childhood trauma, and that in the many years I've been working with the youth, I can't think of any exceptions to that. So this is our practice framework and philosophy. We have adopted a harm reduction approach, which in government was quite challenging. And then resiliency, strength-based work, and we use the work of Michael Unger, who's a social work doctor of social work from Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, um, and really speaks to our population of youth and how we can help youth be more resilient in their lives. Community collaboration, and this is certainly an acknowledgement that these are very complex youth and we can't do this work on our own, and that we need to put our heads together and be working together and building a support network under the youth, and that giving them the strong message that they're part of that network as well, in that they're involved in the decision making and that we're listening to what they feel they need in their lives and how what ways that we can be involved in the life that are meaningful and relevant to them. And our practice framework and philosophy is informed by attachment theory and trauma and brain development. And so the whole focus is on relationship-based practice. And these pillars of the framework and philosophy get us to that relationship-based practice. So where do this population of troubled and challenged youth come from? Um, as I said, they've experienced trauma and typically come with quite significant attachment issues as well, all of which, of course, have an impact on the brain. We know abuse, neglect, and violence and disruption of secure bonds evoke terror and utter helplessness in children who rely on their adults to calm their emotions. And this is one of the day-to-day challenges that we have working with the youth, in that they have difficulty self-regulating and being able to manage their own emotions. And again, in a punishment-based way of working, we tend to see that as the youth being challenging us and being resistant and defiant, but it's part of the package they come with, and haven't had that experience of being able to learn to regulate their emotions from an early age. So it's only as their brains mirror comforting caregivers can gradually learn to calm themselves. So that's often an area that the youth have missed out on. That when they're babies and they have a need and they cry, and then the caregiver picks them up, may cuddle them, change them, feed them, um, and then the need is met. It becomes predictable for the child, and then they learn to calm down. but traumatized children have not yet developed that emotional regulation. And so they go through life experiencing pervasive stress, which we see through their anxiety, fear, rage, guilt, depression. And these last few are significant: attention deficits, impulsivity, explosiveness, oppositional behavior, and conduct problems. Because we see many of our youth and our multidisciplinary team that I had mentioned at the beginning, most of the youth that come to that table have that cluster of diagnoses of ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, oppositional defiance disorder, and conduct problems. So I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist. So it's not that they're not valid as a diagnosis, but when we do see that cluster of diagnoses, and we start then asking about the history of the child, and typically then we would see that they've come from a history of trauma. Um, but some of the challenge in the medical model system is that they may be medicated to deal with these diagnoses, but they don't necessarily get to the root of the problem, which is the abuse and neglect and the trauma that comes with that. So we do have a lot of youth that are medicated, which can be helpful, but unless we're getting to the root of the problem over time, we're not going to see too much change, of course. So Sandra Bloom says, the question we should be asking is not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. And I think relevant not only for child protection, of course, but also for um, whether in addictions or mental health or in the physical health area, that it's important we ask those questions. This was a study by Dr. Felitti and Dr. Anda in the United States in San Diego area, where in the ER they were asking people, typically from middle class backgrounds, if they had experiences 1 of 10 traumas in their life, and they learned that the more traumas they had experienced, it exponentially resulted in risk to areas such as mental health problems, um, depression, physical health problems, shorter lifespan, risk for addictions, um, dramatically higher risk in many of those areas. And we know, as I mentioned earlier, too, with the youth that they're typically scoring from 6 to 10, making them really dramatically at risk for mental health and physical health challenges throughout their lives. And it's something we need to be working with the youth on, and not punishing them for um, having these traumas and having these struggles in their life. But as I have mentioned a number of times already, that's what we have tended to do, and so we're taking the most vulnerable population, the most isolated, the most excluded youth in society, and then punishing them because they're not doing things the way we think they should do. And that's the area we just need to be really having conversations about and examining, and seeing how unhelpful that approach is. We know our youth walk around with a lot of shame and guilt, and the sense of failure that they can't succeed in life. And then we use methods that are punishing, as if heaping more shame, guilt, and failure on the youth is somehow going to result in positive outcomes. And we just don't see that being the case. And again, speaks to why it's so critical that our child protection system examines practice and starts to shift away from that punishment model. So we know the most destructive abuse comes not from stranger danger, but from the very individuals that children have learned to love. And of course, there's no program that exist to deal with the terror abuse from the trusted people, the very people that should be caring, nurturing, and guiding them, are simply not there for them. So in the case of extreme emotional neglect and deprivation, the brain simply fails to develop the relevant neurological architecture to begin to handle life, essentially. Um, the social emotional experiences that they're going to have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, that they don't have the competencies to be able to manage effectively. But we know that behaviors are not the result of moral failings or lack of willpower or bad character, which is again how we tend to label the behaviors in youth that we don't like. Of course, in order to function, children depend on attachments. But what we know from talking to the youth is the caseworker is a significant person in their life, and is involved in making decisions that can have lifelong impacts on them. So ethically, I think we need to be very involved with the youth, and we need to be also developing relationships with the youth, and we can only do that by spending time with them and getting to know them and allowing them to get to know us. But we downplay that, and I think we underestimate our role as caseworkers in the child protection system. But I think we have a critical role to play in helping youth feel safe, feeling that people care, and feeling that they have people to reach out to when they need help and support. If you feel safe and loved, your brain becomes specialized in exploration, play, and cooperation. If you are frightened and unwanted, it specializes in managing feelings of fear and abandonment. Um, so if we don't take the time to be building the relationship with them, they continue to feel alone and isolated, and all their energy is going into managing the fears that they have in their life, or the constant rejection and abandonment they're feeling from not only their family before, but by people in the system that are supposed to be helping them as well. And I think well, youth have told us that their relationships with workers are problematic, are based on power and control, and not on caring and nurturing. So they continue to feel rejected and abandoned. So how much are we then contributing to the youth healing and learning to build relationships? So when the youth are trying to manage the terror by themselves, it gives rise to a whole host of problems, dissociation, which is, I think, very prominent in our population, despair, addictions, anxiety and panic, and relationships that are marked by alienation, disconnection, and explosion, which means we walk into those scripts continuously because youth expect us to give up on them, be frustrated with them, because that's the way their life is played out. That's what they have come to expect. So they test us, they push us to see, which can be challenging time in the work with youth, but it's also a very important time for the youth. They need to know if we're going to be just the next one in the next person in their life that's going to get involved and then give up on them and then reject and abandon them again. So for them not to test us and see if that's the case is very rational in my mind. And the part that's irrational is expecting youth with whom we have no relationship to be listening to us and doing what we are telling them to do. Um, I, why would they? Would they when they have built no connection? There's no relationship. There's certainly no trust, and we expect that they're going to stop all their what we see as their negative behaviors, and then start complying and changing their life. That is simply not the reality. But again, we can put that onto the youth because of the power we have to say they're not following through, they're being disrespectful, rather than looking at ourselves and saying, why would the youth just fall in line and do everything we expect when we haven't taken the time to get to know them and build a relationship? We need to appreciate the risk that youth are taking when they allow us into their world. And I think we really need to respect that as workers, but it's not something that we even become aware of if we're in the more traditional approach of punishing the youth when they're not complying. So this quote comes from trauma expert Bessel van der Kolk. So as long as their map of the world is based on trauma, abuse, neglect, people are likely to seek shortcuts through oblivion, which we see through their addictions, their various addictions. Anticipating rejection, ridicule, and deprivation, they're reluctant to try out new options. Certain of these will lead to failure, which, as we've discussed, is very much on the surface of their thinking that ultimately they're gonna fail. This lack of experimentation traps people in the matrix of fear, isolation, and scarcity, where it's impossible to welcome the very experiences that might change their basic worldview. So the experience of being in a relationship can challenge that negative template of the world, but not being fearful of giving up that control, they're reluctant to try the very things that could make a positive impact in their lives. So abused and neglected children suffer unpredictable danger, living, especially when they're streetwise, having to find resources because they're homeless. It becomes a very dangerous and unpredictable world for them. They have no idea when the next assault or hurt will take place, leaving them feeling helpless. So what we see with our youth is their survival is often under threat, or that perception that it's under threat. And then when they're unable to control their environment, and we've talked about how important that control is, they have no choice but to be in survival mode. So very hyper vigilant. If you're vibrating at a very high stress level, it takes very little to push you over the top and get into these situations where these can be explosive and defiant, argumentative. But again, it comes based out of fear, not based out of wanting to harm us or taunt us or make our lives difficult, which means we'll be taking their actions personally, which is not productive. So this sets up a vicious cycle that chronic arousal coupled with lack of parental comfort made them disruptive, oppositional, aggressive, and again, relating back to the ADHD, ODD, and conduct disorder. But their behavior, their aggression can make them unpopular, especially with peers and teachers. And then that gets them into that cycle, that rejection and punishment cycle, because their behaviors don't make them popular, obviously. And there's often what you would expect with peers, a lack of understanding of where they've come from and what's triggering such behaviors. And it's not surprising that this relating back to the lack of healthy people in their lives, but the adults who do try and get involved with them, they see us as authority figures and not trustworthy, dishonest, self-centered, rejecting, inconsistent, stupid, and not really caring about them. Some of the comments that we get from the youth, well, you're just paid to do this, you don't care. And of course, with many workers in the field, that's obviously not the case. Thankfully, these children have learned to expect parents, foster parents, relatives, teachers, and other authorities to become rejecting or abusive because that has been their template of the world. So this is one of my favorite slides, and it comes from a psychologist in London, England. And she says there is nothing more one can do to them, the youth, which would frighten them into behaving better. The violated child is emotionally too disorganized to make the necessary connections and learn from the infliction of punishment. So we ask, well, how do they view punishment? And it typically experiences rejection, which ends up deepening the child's resentment. So what we're trying to change, we actually are reinforcing in a punitive way of working, um, and again speaks to the need to keep building relationships, and the more more healthy relationships the youth have, then the more likely that they're going to take the risk and allow people into their world and start hopefully then seeing the world in a more positive light. But to do that, we have to get off the scripts that the youth put out for us, that we often just walk right into, which is not helpful. So it's not helpful to be labelled oppositional when in fact the behaviour is rooted in an attempt to protect oneself against real danger. And youth will protect themselves emotionally, and not want to risk further rejection and abandonment in their life, which we need to understand and respect the youth when they are swearing at us, when they are pushing us away, when they are telling us we're not helpful and they don't want us around, and that we're more harmful to them than we are helpful. This is just the testing behaviors that we need to work through, and requires a lot of patience when we're working with the youth. So children who do act out in pain rather than lock it down, and again, here we see the oppositional defiant behavior, and the conduct disorder as well, along with the attachment disorder. But these labels ignore the fact that rage and withdrawal are only facets of a whole range of desperate attempts at survival. Trying to control the child's behavior when failing to address the underlying issue, the abuse, or to argue the trauma, leads to treatments that are not effective at best and harmful at worst. And I think we can add more harm to the youth when we're not building the relationship, and when we're putting demands on them, and we are running the risk that we're going to further emotionally harm the youth, which is going to push them away even more and make it even less likely that they're going to allow themselves to connect with an adult that is genuinely trying to help them, because they've painted us with the wrong brush based on their experience. So I've shared with you a lot of, I think, heavy information, but certainly don't want to give you the belief that there is no hope. There's much hope with this population of youth, and working with them, it can be very rewarding. Getting to know them, appreciating that they've taken the risk to allow us into their lives, and to build a relationship, and see some of the changes that they're making in their lives, seeing them reach out for help, to their support network that's being created for them, and starting to heal them and move on with their lives in positive ways. And it's a good learning, as a worker, learning from the youth and learning how to improve our practice and become better people as well. Um, so if poor relationships are where things emotionally go wrong, then healthy relationships are where things can be put right. And being able to feel safe with other people is probably the single most important aspect of mental health. Um, and living in isolation, as many of our youth have, and not having anybody to feel safe with, is profoundly sad, for the youth to be going through that. Safe connections are fundamental to meaningful and satisfying lives, and should be driving us to be building those relationships. But in order to feel emotionally close to another person, our defensive system must be temporarily shut down. And this is one of the challenges we have in working with the youth in getting to the point of allowing them to be vulnerable in a safe way. But the brain remains plastic throughout life, and it can restructure itself in light of new experiences. And this is really important to keep in mind, because often healthy relationships with people is part of that new experience for a lot of our youth. Um, we can actually, with a lot of repetition and a patterned way, and all working from the same page and being consistent with the youth, we can actually help the youth's brain create new neural pathways because of that new experience. And I think that's incredibly profound to think that we can have an impact on the brain of a youth, and help make changes that can, that they can build on as they get older. Um, so all of this has exciting implications for therapy, counseling, and relationship-based social work. And that kind of intervention is very dramatic and very profound. So, Dr. Bruce Perry, who's a psychiatrist and an expert on attachment and trauma, showed that while children are malleable, they are not independently able to overcome adversity. Children adapt to their environments and grow up psychologically healthy if they're provided with the resources necessary to modify neurological functioning. So, as workers or helpers, we need to avoid being drawn into conflict cycles marked by power struggles, counter aggression, and avoidance. And again, this that fits with the punishment model. And when we're doing training, we will talk about how unhelpful it is to be getting into power struggles with youth. The three strikes, when youth will see once they've got the first strike, they'll bring on the other two because they know they've failed. Or the zero tolerance, where there's so many rules, it sets the youth up for failure. We're going to look at two key pillars of the practice framework for working with this population of youth. The first being harm reduction, and the second being the resiliency strength-based approach. These will be very brief, just given the time limitation. We also won't be discussing the strategies we use in working with youth. They've been embedded throughout the presentation, and they are outlined in the book as well. Well, harm reduction, it comes from the addictions world, of course, but it's expanded to also look at behavior and lifestyle challenges and a number of addictions, not just drugs and alcohol, as we have discussed. It's particularly important in the engagement phase. And it is good that we're able to work from this approach, being in government. Which working in a risk management system, this has been, I think, a big win in being able to see harm reduction as a very viable practice method, particularly for this population. Um, Part of its value is it's very non-judgmental. As you can see in the last point there, it's an anti-oppressive practice, and it puts youth in a position of seeing them as experts in their own lives and being able to have a say in what makes sense for them. And hopefully then that leads to them uh, buying into the process more, and pushing them to kind of see where they're at, and how their challenges may be interfering with their life, and supporting the changes that they want to make at any given time. So it allows defenses to drop, and we've talked previously about the need to have a sense of vulnerability in order to build relationships and start to build trust. So as we've talked about at length, it gets off the punishment script, and youth are involved in making choices and decisions that make sense for them, and they're supported by the treatment team working with the youth. So that invites relationship, of course, because it gets away from the power struggles, and gets away from them being forced to do things that they don't think are relevant to them. Does not reinforce shame, guilt, and sense of failure, which we also talk about that being connected to the trauma that all of these youth have experienced throughout their lives. Does not assume that trust is a goal, but rather safety and the ability to make choices. The focus is not that they must trust us, the focus is that they're safe, and that they're in a position of vulnerability where they're able to talk about what's going on in their life and look at changes. The next point makes a direct connection to the resiliency, and you see this is a quote by Michael Unger. Um, and it's helps youth navigate and negotiate the resources they need for their well-being, which we'll talk a bit about in a little while. So harm reduction is simply a set of strategies and tactics that encourage individuals to reduce the risk or harm to themselves and possibly their communities too by their various behaviors. And it's about educating the person to be more aware of the risks of their behavior, and then gives them some tools and resources for which they can reduce the risk. And the only way to be able to do that is to be engaging in conversation. And something I always say when I'm doing training on harm reduction is if you're not having conversations with the youth, you're not doing harm reduction, and that's critical. And the beauty of it, it also makes it more intentional and thoughtful in what we're saying and what we're doing when we're with the youth, and part of that treatment team as well. So the principles, it's a humanistic approach, which is very important, because it implies it's something not imposed on them. It's a partnership. It's something we're all working. The treatment team or the safety net that I've been talking about. All the people on there on the same approach and have the same focus and philosophical base. It does not deal solely with behaviors, but the whole person with complex needs. And obviously, we've seen how complex this population of youth is. But it doesn't identify them by their addictions or by their behavior or by their lifestyle. That's something that comes with them as a whole person, and allows us to start looking at some of the strengths that they possess as well, and tapping into how they can build on those strengths in order to build confidence in themselves and be able to make changes. So this also accepts that risk is a natural part of our lives, and it is with everybody, not just with this population, of course. But we can never eliminate risk, and these youth are living lives that often can put them in danger, and we're not going to be able to monitor them 24 hours a day. This is a bit of a challenge again for a government that works in a risk management or risk mitigation mentality, because no matter what policies and legislation they put in place, we cannot eliminate the risks that the youth will put themselves in. So how do we work with them and open communication and have discussions about safety, so we can at least work with them on minimizing some of that risk. Places risky behavior on a continuum within the context of a person's life. And this is again one of the really beautiful pieces of harm reduction, in that we can plot everybody we're working with on this continuum based on their life experiences, um, their developmental, cognitive abilities, their age, their connections they have in their life. And it makes us understand how unique each individual is, and then a harm reduction approach will push us to focus on the needs of that youth and gets away from the formula responses of when we see problem A, then we just implement solution A, because that's what we do with everybody. But it doesn't work for everybody. We know that, because everybody interprets life, interprets trauma, interprets the present circumstances very differently, and and so our work with them is very unique to each individual. So harm reduction looks at a person's relationship to the behavior as defined by him or herself, and that helps us focus with the youth on what they see as important and what they see as priorities, and that we're not making assumptions. Accepts that behavioral change is often incremental, and this requires a lot of patience and seeing a lot of setbacks that the youth have. So again, we can say, well, they're not cooperating, they're not working with us, and punish them for that, or we can help pick them up and say, let's keep trying. This is important. You want to make these changes. You want to stop using. You want to get back into school. So, what are the barriers? How can we all work together on overcoming them? And again, that fosters just a building of the relationship. That any positive is seen as significant, and this may be a youth phoning us very excited and saying, I've been clean for 7 days, or I haven't cut for 2 weeks now. And it's certainly something that we can celebrate with them because they are significant milestones. And the youth possibly is coming from a point where they didn't see that they could be successful in staying away from alcohol or avoid cutting themselves. So interventions are not rigid, require creativity and innovation reflective of a person's life situation. And again, it's not for us to have all the answers for the youth or the service team, and that we're all working together and can think outside the box and come up with solutions that are more meaningful and make sense for the youth. So it builds on existing strengths and capacities and helpful for communities, and as I mentioned, comes from the addictions world. So some comments here about why harm reduction works for the youth, and this is some of the feedback we have from the youth. The service and supports meet youth where they are at, and that their input is essential in the process. Recognizes that youth are experts in their own lives, and again that mantra of seeing them as experts in their own lives and have a lot to contribute. Empowering for the youth, and a comment here that direct quote, by working with us and not for us, solutions that make sense for in our lives will be possible, which is a nice comment that fits with anti-oppressive practice. So some comments on what harm reduction is not about, and I've heard these comments over the years many times and had discussions with people, and I understand that harm reduction can be quite contentious, and interpreted very differently by different people. So it's not about letting you do whatever they want and letting them be in control. It's a partnership. It's working together, um, and letting them do whatever they want, I think, would be a case of neglect, because you're not having conversations, you're not talking about safety, you're not creating safety, and that's not what the youth are asking for, because when they're coming to us and they're making connections with us, they are wanting us to be involved. So then if we just say, well, it's harm reduction and you make the choice and you do whatever you see fit, we're not providing any guidance or support or help. It's also not about encouraging negative or risky behavior. Of course, we don't like what the addictions, what the lifestyle challenges, what the behaviors do to these youth. They're often destructive, and we care about the youth. We want to see them succeed, and we're putting part of ourselves into working with the youth to help them make some positive changes. So that'd be totally contradictory that we would just allow them to engage in the risky behavior without talking to them about it, and again having those conversations. So it's not about avoiding responsibility and avoiding dealing with issues. Harm reduction tackles those issues head on. These are the conversations that we're having with youth about safety, about what the addictions or the destructive behavior does to their lives, how it's creating barriers for the youth getting to where they want to get to in their lives. So it actually is the opposite, I would argue, in that it helps them take responsibility and pushes them to create safety in their lives, and not about coddling the youth either. Um, these are tough conversations that we're often having, but having built some credibility with the youth, then we can nudge them, push them to confront their own demons that they have, which can be very threatening and difficult to do. So it's certainly not the easiest road. Coddling youth would be the easier path, of course, but that's not why we're in this business. We're in this business because we want to make a difference in the lives of the youth, and not about rewarding or reinforcing poor choices either. Because again, we don't like what the lifestyle and the addictions are doing to the youth. They're leaving children in dangerous situations, and this was we were challenged on this because some of the youth that we work with are parenting, and this is an ethical situation. Some of the critique was that we're working with the youth and we don't want to see bad things happen to them, so we may overlook some of the situations that they're putting the children in, such if they're high or using around the child and not able to look after the child. Um, but we have legislation and ethics and our values that would prevent us from doing that. In fact, what we would be doing is having conversations with those young parents and being upfront with them and telling your child can't look after themselves. They can't take themselves out of danger. So if child protection is going to become involved, it's probably going to be us that's going to be creating that situation. And that can challenge the relationship. But if we've built up enough credibility and we're upfront and transparent, um, then the youth have been quite accepting of that and understand that they don't want to put their their child in danger either. Um, and it's something we work on together. And if child protection does have to be involved, it will be the child will have a worker from a separate office, because we can't do that dual role trying to support the mother and the child, because then if there's situations that come up, we have to protect the defenseless, which is a child, and then the young parent can feel quite betrayed or that they've lost their support. So it can be challenging to navigate the situation, but in short, just say we would not leave a child in a dangerous situation, and that again, it's about having conversations and being upfront with the young mums. Um, for the next few slides, I'm not going to go through this in detail, and I can leave that with you. This is a comparison on what traditional child protection approaches versus using harm reduction, and how they can look quite different and be a better way to work with the youth. So we'll talk briefly on resiliency and strength-based practice, which is the work of Michael Unger. And we use his work in the High Risk Youth Initiative as he speaks so well to our population. So Dr. Unger will say resiliency is equally present in young people who have been labeled dangerous, delinquent, deviant, or disordered. We've been using the labels resistant, manipulative, defiant, and uncooperative, but meaning essentially the same thing. And one of the differences that between all youth is that some youth have many resources they can call on, whether it's family, people in the community, just general wealth, privilege that they have, and can draw from that vast set of resources that they have available to them in their lives. The youth that we're working with are resilient as well, but just have a very narrow set of resources, often not having family, not having people in the community, until perhaps we can make ourselves present in their lives and help them. But they are remarkably resilient in what they have. Whether they're living on the street or involved in our system, living in group homes, but they still are trying to get muddle through their life, create their own identity, and demonstrate resiliency. And some of what Michael Unger calls hidden resiliency, um, that the youth may not see in themselves, but once we get to know them, we can start to see some of that hidden resiliency, and then there are areas that we can build and work on. Resilient youth take advantage of whatever opportunities and resources are available, even those we consider negative or destructive. So we know youth may find street families or drift towards gangs, which obviously we don't see in a positive light, but it can give them a sense of belonging, a sense of meaning, and a sense of identity that they're otherwise missing. Part of the challenge we have with our youth is that they tend to be youth that are isolated, that they're excluded, that they can be targets in society as well, particularly Indigenous youth and visible minority youth that can be targeted by systemic racism in the children's services system, or in the police system, or in the medical system as well, and the justice system. So then, how do we work with the youth on gravitating towards more proactive and healthy areas in their life instead of drifting toward negative or destructive? Because if that's all they have, then that's what they will draw on to find meaning in their life. So of course we tend to see that as very negative and criticize youth for it, but we don't give them many options on the other hand. So this brings us to the topic of substitution that Michael Unger discusses. And this is another very challenging concept that we often talk about, because as social workers and caseworkers, we're kind of programmed to want to be moving forward, wanting to fix things, wanting to make changes. But for some youth, they may be content, or at least perhaps stuck, or still getting something out of their current circumstances and don't want to change. For example, um, and we've had this situation happen a number of times. A youth, say 15, is leaving the young offender center or jail, and says, I like doing crystal meth. I like being on the street. I like hanging out with my brothers. They've got my back. Um, I don't need anything from you guys. We're thinking, well, that's not a safe lifestyle. We need to be doing something. We can't just accept what the youth wants to do. But whatever they're involved in is perhaps filling a need of identity, of a sense of belonging. And what we have to offer them is a group home with rules, seeing their probation officer, going to see their addictions counselor, that they have to go to school, and they weigh up those differences and say, no thanks. What I've got now, it's adrenaline. It feeds what I want to get out of life at this point, and they're not thinking things through, perhaps. But we don't have anything to offer that is equal or better than that. So sometimes we need to be patient, but we need to be continue to be a presence as well. Because when things do fall apart, as they often do when they're living on the street, which can be very unforgiving when they step out of line. And then if we're in the background saying, hey, do you need anything? Worried about you? Anything I can help you with? Do you need a bus pass? Do you need clothes? Are you hungry? And then we give them an opportunity to be able to reach out to somebody that can help them. And then it's relationships that'll kind of make that equal or better than what they have at some point. And then we can start to engage and move forward. But thinking again, what can we offer that is meaningful for them? And then when they don't choose what we want them to do, then of course we can slip back into that punishment way of doing things, which isn't helpful. So again, children and youth do what the best they can with what they've got, and our youth have very little, but we can take steps to make them to help them, I should say, be more resilient and start building safety, start building opportunities, and help them to start navigating and negotiating the resources they need. Um, and this ecological understanding of resilience implicates those who control the resources, Michael Unger tells us. And that's us. And we need to be taking those steps to be doing that and building resilience in the youth. And that comes with building relationships. So it's all circular and kind of feeds into each other. We shift away from the punishment perspective. We start building connections. We involve the youth in what's going on and the decisions being made. We help build resilience, which fosters more relationship and more connecting. And then hopefully that's giving the youth a sense of empowerment, more self-worth, that they feel value, that they feel that they can actually take on some of the challenges in their life. And ultimately, I find most of our youth want whatever other youth want. Um, when we're doing the service plan with them, they talk about they want the education that's always remains valuable to them. They want to get a job. They want a house at some point, a very car, very mainstream things. But the disconnect with our youth is that some fantasy up in the corner here that they don't think they'll ever get there. Well, for a lot of youth, it's just a natural course of things, but that's again not our youth. But we can start bridging that gap and to start making those things more realistic for them, rather than further alienating them and isolating them and excluding them from mainstream society, which just builds up their anger and perhaps they have nothing to lose by lashing out at society. So I can end the presentation there. So thank you for taking this in. I think in child protection work, there is just so much potential that we're not tapping into and using. And again, I'm focusing on youth. I think this is very relevant for children. I think it's very relevant for families, that we take a very different perspective, incorporate different modes of practice such as harm reduction, resiliency, collaborative work, and we really focus on being intentional about moving away from the punishment model of practice, which I don't think has served our children, youth, and families well. And this is exciting because I think it can make people more excited about their practice. It can re-energize workers in working with a very challenging and tough population of youth. But it is rewarding, um, and we can honor the youth for allowing us to be part of their lives and journeying with them to help them make changes. And we've seen, of course, many great stories from the youth that even some of the youth that we weren't overly optimistic that there was going to be significant change that have taken huge steps in making changes in their life. And we consistently find with our youth, once they buy into relationship, they don't want to give that up. And if we respect that and we pay particular attention into the ending of the relationship being a positive and that it's marked with some kind of ceremony, celebration, that they're more likely then to allow other people into their world and start building a network that can stay with them throughout their lives. So thank you for joining me, and good luck with your work. And I hope you got some value out of the presentation. All the best.